Alright, this topic is called Properties of Real Numbers, and I think of it kind of like in English class when you need to know like the parts of speech. You need to know what a noun is, you need to know what a verb is, you need to know what an adjective, adverb, gerund, all that good stuff is. This is kind of the same thing in math. You need to know the fancy mathematical names for a lot of the properties that feel like common sense. So what I want you to do is get out your notebook and write these down. I'll try to go slow enough that I give you time to copy what I'm writing, but if I forget, you have the pause button, so aren't you lucky? Alright, so let's get started. We're going to start with the commutative property. I think that one is probably commutative property. Basically, it's just like when you commute somewhere. What are you doing? You're moving from one place to another. So the commutative property is something that you've known probably since you were like in first grade. So you already know that 5 plus 6 is the same thing as 6 plus 5. They both equal 11. Doesn't matter which order that you put them in. So that's your commutative property of addition. And there is also a commutative property of multiplication. Again, you knew this once you started learning your math facts. So you know that 7 times 5 is exactly the same answer as 5 times 7. So again, these are common sense things that you know about, but they have this fancy name, commutative property, and you need to know that. Okay. Let's also do associative property. Associative property. This one may not be such common sense, like you probably didn't learn it overtly, but it does make sense. Associative property, I try to remember it because what do you do when you associate with people? Sometimes you're in the same group as them, that sort of thing. And the associative property is all about parentheses. So we know that 3 plus 4 plus 5, and if we put parentheses around that, is going to be exactly the same as if we take 3 plus and then in parentheses do 4 plus 5. Because it's addition on both sides all the way through, it doesn't matter where you put those parentheses, you can put them anywhere and it's still going to be equal to each other. So that's the associative property of addition. Again, when you associate with people, you're in the same group, think parentheses, so that's one way to remember it. There's also an associative property for multiplication, again, because when you multiply numbers, it doesn't really matter what order they're in. So if you do 5 times 6 times 7, it's going to be the same thing as 5 times 6 in parentheses times 7. Either way. And so that's your associative property for multiplication. Alright, let's move this up a little bit and get to the next one. The next one we'll talk about is the identity property. Identity property. How do you remember this one? Identity property means you get yourself back. You see yourself. That's how I guess I remember it. So the identity property, for instance, is like 3 plus 0. What do you get? You get that 3. Let's say, I don't know, anything that you add. So it's because there's a 0 there. So that's your identity property for addition. And for multiplication, what is it that we do to get the number back? We multiply by 1. So 5 times 1 gives you 5. 6 times 1 gives you 6. 304 times 1 gives you 304. So all that is your identity property for multiplication. Again, getting yourself back is kind of the best way to remember that. Alright, let me move that up. Probably still copying. Move this guy up first. There's another property again that you know. It was probably your favorite times table when you were in elementary school learning your times tables. And what do they call this? The multiplicative. Ugh, it's a lot of words. Multiplicative property of 0. And again, if you don't panic by all the big words, what is it asking you? It's saying, dude, what happens when you multiply a number by 0? You get 0. Well, they decided to call that the multiplicative property of 0. So it's 6 times 0, what does it give you? 0. 104 times 0, that's going to give you 0. It's not really that exciting, but it is a property that you need to learn. So, and it's kind of an easy one because again, it's nothing new that you haven't seen before. Okay, let me move some of these things up a little bit. There we go. Cool. All right. Let's do distributive property. Most of you guys have seen this before, unless you're relatively new to algebra. And the distributive property is stuff that you have seen if you have worked in algebra at all. So what does it mean? It means that if you have a number outside of parentheses and stuff inside the parentheses, that is equal to multiplying that number outside through both of them. And again, that's something that if you have done any work in algebra, you're just like, yeah, I know that. Well, in case you didn't know, it had a fancy name called the distributive property. How else might they put it? They might also just use all numbers. 5 times 7 plus 6. And that's going to be the same thing. Actually, yeah, this looks messy and gross, but they just write it out like this. So it's the same type of thing. And they do like to write it like this. I've seen it on like standardized tests and such things. It just looks so gross. You're just like, what are you talking about? But if you kind of analyze what they've done, you're like, oh yeah, I get it. They multiplied the 5 through. And so then it kind of clicks. Alright, and there's only one other property that I can think of, so let me slide this sucker up, slide this up first, and that. The next property is called the inverse property. It's something like that. I'm not sure that I have the exact inverse property of, and again, inverse property, you'll have one for addition and one for multiplication. I will call it the inverse property for now. Let's see. So inverse property. For addition, all it means is that if you have a number and you add its opposite, you get 0. That's all it means. 2 plus negative 2 is 0. Another example would be 10 plus negative 10, and that equals 0. So it's just showing you that if you add the opposite, you get 0. I suppose we could flip it around and do negative 100 plus its opposite, which is positive 100, equals 0. So that's your inverse property, and those examples are for inverse property of addition. Okay. Slide this up. And if there's an inverse property for addition, of course there's going to be one for multiplication. When you multiply numbers, though, you can't just multiply by their opposites. That doesn't give you, that doesn't kind of get rid of the number or cancel the number out. So for multiplication, the inverse property, oops, I want my pen back, not moving things around. So for inverse property of multiplication, you would do something else. It's going to be like 2 times, and here's the fancy word, 2 times its reciprocal, and you get down to 1. So for inverse property of addition, you get down to 0. When you get it for multiplication, you want to get down to 1. So for, I don't know, 45, to show the inverse property for multiplication on this, you would do times its reciprocal, which is just 1 over the number. And again, that gets down to 1. You could also start with the fraction. I suppose you could do 1/5 multiplied by its reciprocal, which is 5 over 1. And again, this is kind of common sense. When you started learning fractions and this sort of thing, you knew that they would cancel out and give you 1. But they want you to know that there's a fancy name for this. So it's the inverse property for multiplication. And I remind myself how to remember it. You get down to 1. So sometimes knowing that when you're looking at this big long list of things and you have to match them up or something. So multiplication, you get down to 1. Alright, I hope that helped. Again, they're not the easiest things to remember at all times, but if you keep notes, that will definitely help you if you're allowed to look back at them. And they're not as disgusting as they sound. A lot of them are just common facts you already know. You just have to be able to sort through them and know which one is happening in which case. That's all. Good luck.